The Story of Knos, a Swedish fairy tale. Once upon a time there was a poor widow who found an egg under a pile of brush as she was gathering kindlings in the forest. She took it and placed it under a goose, and when the goose had hatched it, a little boy slipped out of the shell. The widow had him baptized Knos, and such a lad was a rarity, for when no more than 5 years old he was grown and taller than the tallest man, and he ate in proportion, for he would swallow a whole batch of bread at a single sitting, and at last the poor widow had to go to the commissioners for the relief of the poor in order to get food for him. But the town authorities said she must apprentice the boy at a trade, for he was big enough and strong enough to earn his own keep. So Knos was apprenticed to a smith for 3 years. For his pay he asked a suit of clothes and a sword each year, a sword of 500 weights the first year, one of 1000 weights the second year, and one of 1500 weights the third year. But after he had been in the smithy only a few days, the smith was glad to give him all 3 suits and all 3 swords at once, for he smashed all his iron and steel to bits. Knos received his suits and swords, went to a knight's estate, and hired himself out as a serving man. Once he was told to go to the forest to gather firewood for the rest of the men, but sat at the table eating long after the others had driven off, and when he had at last satisfied his hunger and was ready to start, he saw the 2 young oxen he was to drive waiting for him. But he let them stand and went into the forest, seized the 2 largest trees growing there, tore them out by the roots, took 1 tree under each arm, and carried them back to the estate. And he got there long before the rest, for they had to chop down the trees, saw them up, and load them onto the carts. On the following day, Knos had to thresh. First he hunted up the largest stone he could find, and rolled it around on the grain, so that all the corn was loosened from the ears. Then he had to separate the grain from the chaff. So he made a hole in each side of the roof of the barn, and stood outside the barn and blew, and the chaff and straw flew out into the yard. And the corn remained in a heap on the floor. His master happened to come along, laid a ladder against the barn, climbed up and looked down into one of the holes. But Knos was still blowing, and the wind caught his master, and he fell down and was nearly killed on the stone pavement of the court. "He's a dangerous fellow," thought his master. "It would be a good thing to be rid of him, otherwise he might do away with all of them. And besides, he ate so that it was all one could do to keep him fed." So he called Knos in, and paid him his wages for the full year, on condition that he leave. Knos agreed, but said he must first be decently provisioned for his journey. So he was allowed to go into the storehouse himself, and there he hoisted a flitch of bacon on each shoulder, slid a batch of bread under each arm, and took leave. But his master loosed the vicious bull on him. Knos, however, grasped him by the horns and flung him over his shoulder, and thus he went off. Then he came to a thicket, where he slaughtered the bull, roasted him, and ate him together with a batch of bread. And when he had done this, he had about taken the edge off his hunger. Then he came to the king's court, where great sorrow reigned, because once upon a time, when the king went sailing out at sea, a sea troll had called up a terrible tempest, so that the ship was about to sink. In order to escape with his life, the king had to promise the sea troll to give him whatever first came his way when he reached shore. The king thought his hunting dog would be the first to come running along to meet him, as usual, but instead his 3 young daughters came rowing out to meet him in a boat. This filled the king with grief, and he vowed that whoever delivered his daughters should have one of them for a bride, whichever one he might choose. But the only man who seemed to want to earn the reward was a tailor named Red Peter. Knos was given a place at the king's court, and his duty was to help the cook. But he asked to be let off on the day that the troll was to come and carry away the oldest princess, and they were glad to let him go, for when he had to rinse the dishes, he broke the king's vessels of gold and silver, and when he was told to bring firewood, he brought in a whole wagon-load at once, so that the doors flew from their hinges. The princess stood on the seashore and wept and wrung her hands, for she could see what she had to expect. Nor did she have much confidence in Red Peter, who sat on a willow stump with a rusty old sabre in his hand. Then Knos came and tried to comfort the princess as well he knew how, and asked her whether she would comb his hair. Yes, he might lay his head in her lap, and she combed his hair. Suddenly there was a dreadful roaring out at sea. It was the troll who was coming along, and he had 5 heads. Red Peter was so frightened that he rolled off the willow stump. "Knos, is that you?" cried the troll. "Yes," said Knos. "Haul me up on the shore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said Knos. Then he hauled the troll ashore, but he had his sword of 500 weights at his side, and with it he chopped off all 5 of the troll's heads, and the princess was free. But when Knos had gone off, Red Peter put his sabre to the breast of the princess and told her he would kill her unless she said he was her deliverer. Then came the turn of the second princess. Once more Red Peter sat on the willow stump with his rusty sabre, and Knos, asking to be let off for the day, went to the seashore and begged the princess to comb his hair, which she did. Then along came the troll, and this time he had 10 heads. "Knos, is that you?" asked the troll. "Yes," said Knos. "Haul me ashore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said Knos, and this time Knos had the sword of 10 hundredweights at his side, and he cut off all 10 of the troll's heads, and so the second princess was freed. But Red Peter held his sabre at the princess's breast and forced her to say that he had delivered her. Now it was the turn of the youngest princess. When it was time for the troll to come, Red Peter was sitting on the willow stump, and Knos came and begged the princess to comb his hair, and she did so. This time the troll had 15 heads. "Knos, is that you?" asked the troll. "Yes," said Knos. "Haul me ashore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said Knos. Knos had his sword of 15 hundredweights at his side, and with it he cut off all the troll's heads. But the 15 hundredweights were half an ounce short, and the heads grew on again, and the troll took the princess and carried her off with him. One day, as Knos was going along, he met a man carrying a church on his back. "You are a strong man, you are," said Knos. "No, I am not strong," said he. "But Knos at the king's court, he is strong, for he can take steel and iron and weld them together with his hands as though they were clay." "Well, I'm the man of whom you are speaking," said Knos. "Come, let us travel together." And so they wandered on. Then they met a man who carried a mountain of stone on his back. "You are strong, you are," said Knos. "No, I'm not strong," said the man with the mountain of stone. "But Knos at the king's court, he is strong, for he can weld together steel and iron with his hands as though they were clay." "Well, I am that Knos. Come, let us travel together," said Knos. So all 3 of them travelled along together. Knos took them for a sea trip, but I think they had to leave the church and the hill of stone ashore. While they were sailing, they grew thirsty, and lay alongside an island, and there on the island stood a castle, to which they decided to go and ask for a drink. Now this was the very castle in which the troll lived. First the man with the church went, and when he entered the castle, there sat the troll with the princess on his lap. And she was very sad. He asked for something to drink. "Help yourself, the goblet is on the table," said the troll. But he got nothing to drink, for though he could move the goblet from its place, he could not raise it. Then the man with the hill of stone went into the castle and asked for a drink. "Help yourself, the goblet is on the table," said the troll, and he got nothing to drink either, for though he could move the goblet from its place, he could not raise it. Then Knos himself went into the castle, and the princess was full of joy, and leaped down from the troll's lap when she saw it was he. Knos asked for a drink. "Help yourself," said the troll. "The goblet is on the table." And Knos took the goblet and emptied it in a single draught. Then he hit the troll across the head with the goblet, so that he rolled from the chair and died. Knos took the princess back to the royal palace, and oh, how happy everyone was. The other princesses recognized Knos again, for they had woven silk ribbons into his hair when they had combed it. But he could only marry one of the princesses, whichever one he preferred, so he chose the youngest. And when the king died, Knos inherited the kingdom. As for Red Peter, he had to go into the nail barrel. And now you know all that I know.